and welcome to the Drexel Interview. I'm your host, Paula Marantz Cohen, speaking to you from the Drexel University Picture Gallery. Today our guest is the author, critic, and journalist Christopher Hitchens. Mr. Hitchens is a contributing editor to Vanity Fair and a visiting professor of liberal studies at the New School in New York City. He is here to discuss his latest book, Hitch 22, a memoir. This is a two-part interview. In the first part, we'll be dealing with the more personal aspects of the memoir, and in the second part, the more political aspects, though of course there's bound to be overlap between personal and political. Christopher Hitchens, welcome to the Drexel Interview.
Thanks for having me.
I say Christopher.
Yes, please.
Because I know that you prefer to be called Christopher and not Chris, and you mention in your memoir the fact that early in your career at Oxford, the Marxists with whom you were involved called you Chris, and the tutors and the more elite faculty at Oxford called you Christopher. And I wonder if your preference doesn't suggest an underlying political loyalty from the very beginning.
The loyalty, alas, is less complicated than that. It was to my mother and to her social aspirations. She called me Christopher because she thought it was a nice name. She thought to shorten it to Chris, to circumcise it or amputate it, was a crime. And especially since my second name begins with H, and in England everything depends on the aspirate, and people who drop them are crude. The next thing that happens if you are called Chris and your name is Hitchens is Chris Hitchens. And that she would have thought would be unforgivably lower class.
Your upbringing was middle class, lower middle class, would you say? I don't know if those gradations.
Well, no one in England puts themselves in the lower middle class. They always want to say lower or maybe upper middle, or just middle. My father's family was quite working class. They came from a tough district in the Portsmouth dockyards where my grandfather rose to be a school teacher in a rather hard school. My father got out of it by moving into the Navy, going off to sea. He wouldn't have sounded like me at all. They wouldn't have spoken like this. And my mother's family came from a Jewish background in Liverpool. Again, by no means the forcing house of the British bourgeoisie. And both of them had social aspirations, my mother particularly. And these were projected, is the word, I suppose, onto your humble servant because I was the firstborn, and the proof that you've moved into the middle class proper in England is very simple. At least the firstborn son has to go to a private school.
Okay.
And then to a university.
Okay,
and which none of my family had done before. So I was always very acutely aware of the tiniest social nuances. George Orwell says about the English that they're all branded on the tongue from the moment they're born. It still is amazingly true.
So the accent.
The accent and the avoidance of certain commonplace expressions as well.
Interesting.
And above all, holding on to the H's.
So do you think that this class, this weight of class on you was part of the reason why you felt liberated and became an American citizen? I guess this happened after 9/11, but nonetheless, do you think you were drawn in that direction?
Well, I can't explain completely why it was that in my teens I began to have this very strong need to come to the United States. But there it was. It was as strong as my need to become a writer. It wasn't a desire, it was a compulsion. In fact, I now realize they were probably two aspects of the same thing. But no question about it, yes, it was a means of getting out of a society that was rather too stratified, with oneself not stratified perhaps quite high up enough on the ladder. And
yet you managed to rise pretty high. I want to talk about your parents. First, your father. You already mentioned the fact that he came from a working class background, but he himself was in the British Navy. You refer to him affectionately and somewhat satirically as the commander. He seems to be a certain sort of British type that you admire and that I feel you feel is a lost breed.
And from a lost empire, too, which was dying, visibly dying while I was growing up. I was being educated in schools that admired and almost were still training you to work for an empire that when you opened the newspaper or turned on the TV, you could see was winding down. Weird feeling. And my father, who'd been all around the world on the deck of a Royal Navy warship, policing this empire, and then had a very tough time in the Second World War, very grueling Second World War, was let go by the Navy shortly after the war and felt that everything he'd worked for and everything he'd given his life to had proved not worthwhile, really, and that he wouldn't have put it like this, but I did. He'd been rather taken for granted and rather exploited by the establishment, the monarchy, the empire, to which he'd been so loyal. And that had a big influence in moving me to the left, because I thought, you do all this, you do everything right, you're brave, you're thrifty, you're flinty, you work, as they say here, work hard and play by the rules, and they don't treat you right.